Hey everybody, Voice of Beetleman here, flying at you, straight out of Saturn's moon, Titan. This is going to be my video response, my second one to Dan Courtney's previous video response to my video response, my original one. And I'm going to try a new editing style to make things a little more contemporary, to flow a little bit faster, smoother, and more structured, pun intended. The primary issue that this debate boils down to, I think, is not between dualism and materialism, not between Christian and atheist or anything else. It boils down to two different kinds of monism. Monism meaning the idea, the belief that there is a single underlying structure, or rather aspect of reality that everything boils down to. So obviously Dan, being a materialist, is a kind of monist. He's a monistic materialist, whereas I'm a kind of monist, a structuralist. Dan believes that everything in reality boils down to the material world and its constituent parts, subatomic particles and the like. And I believe that everything in reality boils down to structures and the subsequent locations in them. Now Dan has posted his response to my video, which is quite well thought out. However, I think that he pretty much misses the mark, not in that his criticism is lacking. His criticism just is pointed in the wrong direction, shall we say. I think that Dan's video and his original video on power can pose a very substantive problem for dualists, dualistic ontologies. However, I don't think that this is a problem for my particular kind of monism at all, and therefore I think that Dan's criticism it's not that it's bad, it just doesn't really have any effect on me. It's fired in a completely different direction, if you will. Before I go into why I think that, I want to quickly try to explain my particular belief about about my particular take on ontology, and to help hopefully clear up some misconceptions that I've been reading in the comments section, and possibly by what Dan has said in his video. It seems that he might misunderstand a few of my views as well. When I say that I am a structuralist about reality, what I am saying is that, like I said, I'm a kind of monist. Instead of believing that everything boils down to material, or everything boils down to either soul matter, like the dualist things, and regular matter, or spiritual material and the physical material, I believe everything boils down to structure. And what is structure? Structure is a ontological form that things can be instantiated in, or rather can be instantiated in what's known as systems. So for instance, when we talk about the natural numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3, and on, we're talking about a particular system that instantiates a particular structure, or instantiates in a particular structure. That structure is an infinite series. So an infinite series with the cardinality of Aleph null, which for people who are not familiar with set theory, in set theoretic terms, Aleph null is the number of the smallest transfinite cardinal. Basically, it's the smallest kind of infinity. The natural numbers exhibit this kind of infinity. But interestingly enough, other kinds of systems exhibit this kind of infinity as well. For instance, all the odd natural numbers, all the even natural numbers, even though they technically are only half of all the natural numbers, they're still the same size of infinity. The same is true for all the prime numbers, for all numbers that end in 2, and so forth. All these things are instantiations. They're different systems. They have different properties. They're unique. However, they all instantiate in the same structure, which is the Aleph null infinite series. Now, why is this relevant to the talk? Well, this is very relevant to the talk because this is actually what Dan is doing. This is actually what everybody, all of us humans, are doing. Human beings talk about reality in a specific way. Human beings talk about reality in a lot of different ways, but especially the scientific kind of way is in a very rigorous way, the language of mathematics and scientific methodologies, which are very dynamic, very deep, rich systems of thought. The problem comes in, however, when Dan starts talking about the concept of space, time, and matter as being fundamental to how we talk about power. The concept of power, he says, requires these three things because the equations we have that describe how powerful something is require that these conditions be met, that something is in time, that it is spatial, and that it is therefore material, or material therefore spatial, however you want to put it. The error in Dan's position here is that he implicitly assumes that reality fundamentally boils down to these particular facts, and I think this is false, and here's why. A dog will interact with a table, the same table that a human will. So for instance, if you're walking through a room and you smack yourself on the table on accident because you're rushing through, you're not being careful, you're going to think about that in a completely different way than a dog who's running through a house and accidentally smacks into a table will. The same with, let's say, a cat or squirrel or a bird or even a bug that might be flying through your house and accidentally smack into the table. All of them are smacking into what we refer to as the table. The table exists in reality, or at least what we call a table exists in reality. But the bug doesn't see a table. It certainly doesn't see a table that you got from IKEA or a particular furniture store, and it certainly doesn't think, oh, that's a nice mahogany table. Oh, too bad I just smacked into it. I hope I didn't scratch it. Obviously it doesn't think like that. The dog doesn't think like that either, neither does a cat. Neither does the bonobo if it was so smacked into the same table. All of us are creatures, and all of us react to reality in very different ways, and we think about it in different ways. This is not just true for different species, but this is true for just the same species, humans, at different ages. For instance, a toddler is going to interact with reality in a fundamentally very different way than a young child in their 8 or 9 years old. A young child will interact with reality very differently than somebody who's in their late teens, and they're going to interact differently than somebody who's in their early 30s and into their 40s, and on and on and on. And this isn't bad. This is just a fact of life. Our cognitive ability, our cognitive structure, if you will, causes us to interact with reality in very different ways. This is not even just true for all adults, but across what we know as time. If we look back several hundred years, people thought of the world very differently. Astrology used to be the cutting edge of understanding the universe, or at least how the stars and such interact with our daily lives, until astronomy and physics came on the scene. Then Newtonian physics was developed, and that revolutionized our view of reality, up until Einsteinian relativistic physics took over. Einsteinian relativistic physics were further backed down and were pushed out of the way in part to include particle physics and quantum mechanics, which now have been pushed aside to involve even more complex systems like string theory and so forth. Now, we haven't abandoned them. Newtonian physics still is very helpful, is very useful. Same with Einsteinian relativistic physics, same with quantum mechanics. But these are just systems that we describe in a very unique way to humans, mathematically. A young child doesn't think of the world mathematically, and certainly a bonobo chimp, or if you want to go really, certainly, a fly, a common housefly, does not interact with the world mathematically. However, it does interact with the world. My point is that Dan assumes that the world, how we interact with it in our current scientific way, in fact a very westernized way of thinking, in the various Eastern philosophies they don't think this way at all, so it's not even cultural. But aside from all that, Dan thinks that this particular mathematical scientific way that we describe currently reality in the terms of molecular structures, atoms, subatomic particles, space, time, the like, are actually reflective directly of the fundamental characteristics of reality itself, and are not just mere conventions that we use to describe what we interact with in reality, the underlying structure of reality. Now, Dan has a few options in order to get out of this critique. His first option is to say that, yes, this critique only would pertain to a dualistic style ontology and has nothing to say about the concept of God in a, for instance, structuralistic, monistic idea of God, like I have. Dan could also try to refute the definition of power that I provided in my last video, thereby saying that the concept of God, even as I have proposed God being powerful, also fails. Dan's third option would be to try to defend his position that our conventions are actually not mere conventions, but actually reflect the fundamental nature of reality. All this talk about atoms, molecules, subatomic particles, etc., not only are just conventions for how we interpret reality through our particular level of consciousness, but actually are talking about discrete real entities and real aspects of the objective reality at a fundamental level. Now, Dan has accused me of throwing out the baby and keeping the bathwater in preferring a structuralist ontology instead of a materialist ontology. But I don't think that this is the case. As I said before, I'm going to be ending this video with a very quick list of reasons why I hold to a structuralist monistic ontology of reality instead of a materialist monistic idea of the underlying structure of reality, or nature or essence of reality rather. And this is because I think that it is more plausible. There are scenarios in which a materialist, if we suppose to start out with a materialist monistic idea of reality, there are contradictions that can be derived, and therefore we must throw out that idea. For instance, the idea that the mind transcends the brain. Now, Dan makes an interesting observation or statement at the end of his video critiquing my video. He says that a brain, or a mind rather, no matter what ontology you take, has instantiation inside of what we call a brain, even if this instantiation is inside of reality where the brain is merely a concept. Well, not really a concept is what I was saying, but I was trying to say that it was a structure, an underlying structure, but we just interpret it as what we call a material brain. He says that either way, there is a correlation between what we call a material brain and what we call the mind. Well, I would first say that only pertains to the human minds, the minds that we come across so far in our interactions, which I would argue is not necessarily even all human brains, or rather human minds. And secondly, even if this is the case, Dan there admits in his video that this could be the case under my ontology. Well, I mean, maybe that's not a big statement, but I still think this is really significant because I believe that this is the case. Yes, of course there's a correlation between what we call the material brain and what we call the human mind. Of course there's a correlation. But correlation is just correlation. And I can just as well hold that there's a correlation between what we interact with the underlying structure of reality being a material brain and a mind just as much as anybody else can. I don't deny that. I don't think that the mind is just floating out there in the ether. That's not it at all. There's an underlying structure to reality, and our particular level of consciousness interprets that structure as what we call consciousness or the mind, and we interpret that as being housed or somehow correlated with what we call the material brain. Remember though, what we call material and what we call the brain and what we interact with in what we call space and time are merely just conventions that our particular level of cognition, our type of cognition, interacts with the underlying structure of reality. This is the central point of my argument in my video and my final rebuttal. So in conclusion, I think that Dan's critique can be very strong against a dualistic ontology, but I don't think Dan's critique at all even affects my particular ontology. And even if it did, Dan has to show that his particular ontology is more plausible than mine. And for instance, I think that the mind transcends the brain if we suppose a materialistic ontology. Various arguments go in favor of that. Planning as modal identity argument, the Leibniz's internalistic Mill argument is another one, phenomenological non-necessity, that argument. I can go into these in more detail at a later time, but I believe that there are problems with the dualistic ontology that are insurmountable as far as I can see. But when I try to go to a materialistic monistic ontology, there are insurmountable problems with that as well. And so I think, in conclusion, that my particular model of ontology is more plausible than either of those, and that's why I stick with it. Thank you.